Today we're coming together because we're all interested in what we do as everyday actions to support nature. Just letting a couple of people into the room. Great. And we are a group of people called ICON Science, Interdisciplinary Conservation Science. And we actually come from a very diverse range of backgrounds, some ecology and conservation, but we work at the intersection of conservation with other disciplines. So planning, design, architecture, health, psychology and behaviour change, and political science. And there are probably others that I've perhaps forgotten. But we're really interested in applied conservation problems and throwing on methods that are needed to address a problem rather than actually seeking out problems to sort of use a particular method, I suppose. The State of the Environment report was something that we probably all read in a state of horror. And for some Australians, I think it was perhaps one of the first times that it became apparent that we were in serious trouble. 19 ecosystems were showing clear sign of collapse, including the Great Barrier Reef and other systems that we care very, very deeply about, and our economy completely depends on. We had many species that people probably assumed were going to continue just to be common in our country, koalas, gang cockatoos, bogong moths, added to the threatened species list, along with 200 other species. More weed species than native species now on the Australian continent for the first time. So imagine that. And I suppose just, top of the list, we continue to lead the world in terms of losing species and extinctions. And when it comes to cities, we know that they're places that on the whole tend to be actually doing okay in terms of human habitat, if you like. So we're actually improving on the air quality and sometimes even water quality. But when it comes to biodiversity, we're continuing to see quite sort of dramatic losses of both habitats and species from the places where we live and work and play. So, in and around Melbourne, we have lots of examples of species that are on the threatened species list and some of our most critically endangered ecosystems. And we have powerful owls and swift parrots, bandicoots. There's a Frankston spider orchid that actually only occurs in Frankston. And if we don't seek out to care for and protect the Frankston spider orchid, it will be no longer. We actually know that cities are places that are, in some respects, disproportionately important for biodiversity. A study that Pia and others, including myself, but it's a very minor author, did a few years ago, found that, tell me if this is the correct way of saying it, Pia, there were 3 times the number of threatened species per unit area in cities, in and around our cities, than there are in their rural counterparts. So they're actually really critically important places to preserve endangered species. And we know that we're losing some of our most critically endangered whole ecosystems as well. You might have seen on the news the other day that we lost one of the core conservation areas of Basalt Plains grassland. This is a place that was set aside, a unique place that was meant to be protected forever under the Melbourne Strategic Assessment. And a bit like the cowboys who knocked down the Corkman Hotel with the view to kind of putting up a 22-storey apartment block, these guys did the same thing on this conservation area of Basalt Plains grassland. Less than 1% of this ecosystem left in the world. I think Australia is probably Australia's most endangered ecosystem. Hello, Stephanie. Well done for finding us. We should probably all get degrees in this room just for actually having the wherewithal to find this place. But it's not just Melbourne that's actually got a problem with ploughing down and frittering away some of our critically endangered ecosystems on the fringes of our cities. We've also got the Cumberland Plains in, that's okay. The Cumberland Plains in Sydney. So this is again, one of Australia's most critically endangered ecosystems, and tens of thousands of hectares of this ecosystem have been designated. Maybe everyone just turn off your microphones if you're listening from home, because we're hearing some snuffling, coffee making sounds, or maybe Negroni, let's hope it's that. And on the fringes of Perth, we've got the same sort of thing. We've got the Swan Coastal Plain. It's actually a world biodiversity hotspot. So one of 15 identified global biodiversity hotspots, hundreds of thousands of hectares have been cleared and are proposed to be continue to be cleared, principally for housing development. So we know that housing is causing a lot of trouble in and around our cities. And, you know, it's not just actually the use of land, but it's also the materials that go into construction. So just the very process of urbanisation is causing problems of extinction in Australia. But it's also the fact that in cities are all the people, and we're the ones who consume and produce waste. And so, of course, that is another reason why cities have to be places and towns have to be places where we consider our actions for biodiversity. But, you know, this topic kind of came about when we had a conversation actually with a Threatened Species Commissioner a number of years ago. And she sat in the room with us and she said, look, maybe you can help me, but, you know, pretty much every day someone says, well, what can I do for biodiversity? And she didn't really have an answer. And so that kind of sparked an interest in our group of actually really trying to get to the bottom of this. What is a biodiversity action? What can we all do for biodiversity? Because the reality is everything that we eat, drink, you know, consume, the way that we travel, the way that we build our houses, they all are biodiversity behaviours. But, you know, that's overwhelming, isn't it? So maybe we need to actually help to prioritise. What are the most important biodiversity behaviours that we should really focus on? How should we actually achieve a bit of change in society towards being able to acknowledge what a biodiversity behaviour is? Is that the slides? Yeah. This is RMIT, guys, Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology. No, I should say it's the concussion people that we really have to blame. I will repeat that just one more time. Yeah, so the key issue that we're talking about today is how do we get people to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem? And let's face it, that's what we all want. So, you know, we obviously can't put our finger out and sort of say it's actually your fault that species are going extinct, it's your fault. Because, you know, the principal problem is that we've got a society that's structured in such a way that we can't necessarily live our lives that's in a way that's actually favourable for biodiversity. So ultimately, it's really about having societal change. But, you know, our spheres of influence are such that things that we do every day can actually be propagated. And we talk about it, we share it, and then other people start doing it. We change social norms, we change expectations of our parliamentarians, and we get societal change. And so that's really the path that we're focusing on. We're not trying to point to people and create blame. We're trying to create societal change for biodiversity to be in a better state than it currently is. So I'm probably going to stop there because that's a kind of broad intro to the idea of action for biodiversity. I'm going to hand over to my lovely colleague, Lily, who's going to talk about how we sort of might go around this process of actually prioritising which behaviours are really the critical ones for us to be thinking about. Thanks, Lily.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, I'm Lily van Eeden. I am affiliated with Icon Science at RMIT, but I actually work for the state government. I'm employed by the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. And so, yeah, as Sarah's painted a picture of lots of the threats that are posed to our environment, but a lot of these threats are either caused by human behaviour directly through our interactions with the environment or indirectly through, you know, industry and other processes that may feel quite distant to you and me. But the fact that there's human elements of these impacts means that we can resolve these problems through human behaviour change as well. And that's an idea that's not gone unrecognised by the government. So in the past, there have always been these state biodiversity plans that set targets for what we want to achieve through environmental actions and what our conservation goals are in Victoria and things like that. And so the current one is the first one that's ever included a strong focus on human nature interactions, understanding how people appreciate nature, how they interact with nature every day, and how people can act in ways that benefit conservation outcomes. But of course, if we want to come up with a meaningful way of approaching this, we have to think about what are the most impactful behaviours? What are we going to get best bang for buck for in terms of encouraging and facilitating people to engage in things that benefit nature? So there was some work done as a partnership between DELP and Icon Science that was led by Dr. Matthew Zielinski, where Matthew recruited a team of conservation experts and asked them to come up with a list of behaviours that they considered could have a positive impact on the environment and that would be relevant to you and me, to anybody who wants to do something to act for the environment. And then as part of that kind of expert consultation process, experts were then invited to think of to what extent can you apply a score that will give an indication of which behaviours have more or less benefit to biodiversity, and also to what extent are we able to facilitate change with regard to those behaviours. So behavioural plasticity, how easy will it be for people to change those behaviours? What kind of barriers might be in place for those people? And so I've got a slide here that gives the results of that. And so I know it's quite small and hard to see, but just what we're aiming for, especially in here, what we're aiming for was what are the behaviours that have the highest impact and will be the easiest for people to adopt. And so there's a subset of behaviours there that include a range of different things, some responsible consumption kind of things. But then we had to think about what would be good targets of government programs and policies. And so this is the outcome of what we came up with, and I'll go through them fairly quickly. But first of all, get out there, spend time in nature. And this is part of the idea that people who spend more time in nature appreciate it more, prioritise nature in the way that they behave. The more you understand and connect with nature, the more likely you are to develop a sense of stewardship over nature and engage in other behaviours that may be beneficial to nature. The second one we've got here is wildlife-friendly gardening. And so this is the idea that people will prioritise planting species in their garden that are locally indigenous and will provide good habitat for native biodiversity. Might be things like retaining tree hollows and thinking about what sorts of things can live in your garden. And so people can do that informally, but there are also partnerships with different local councils where there are programs supporting people to engage in this and education programs and resources available. And my local one is Nillumbik Gardens for Wildlife, and they're really awesome, the volunteers that come and help you in your garden, give you ideas about what you can do in your garden. The third one is get involved, and there are a whole lot of formal environmental volunteering programs in Victoria, but also just things like the things that you engage in, volunteering your time to, pick up litter when you're out in a local park, or just doing things off your own imperative to protect nature. The next one is be a champion for nature, and this is this idea of being an advocate for nature, not just in the way that you might interact with government representatives or industry, but also how you interact with your peers. So take other people on your nature conservation journey and help other people to become more aware of environmental issues and what they can do for the environment. So it's not just you that is going on this journey, you can take other people with you. And the last one there is about being a responsible pet owner. So we've been doing some studies looking at how can we get people to keep their cats contained, and how can we encourage people to comply with dog leashing legislation in natural areas. And so getting people to think about what motivates people to engage with those things. And I think a really important one to think about, especially, well, for both of these things, is social norms. So for those of us who think it's a good idea to keep your cat contained or keep your dog leashed, people who may not engage with those behaviours recognise that what other people think about these behaviours is a good motivator to comply. So if everybody knows that you think the normal thing to do is to keep your cat contained or to keep your dog on a leash when you're in a natural area, that can help people to improve their compliances. And there's some work on cat containment, a partnership between the zoo and the RSPCA, and our research has fed into that. So that's all I had to say. Who's up next? There you go, Alex.
Nothing like a well-oiled machine. And look at my low-tech solution. I always work from notes, and it's paying off at the moment. So I'm Alex, and I often go on about message framing. So this evening, I'm going to give a very overview of my key lessons for framing more effective conservation messages. And if you remember nothing else from what I say today, and you should never underestimate that possibility, please do remember that how you say stuff matters. So, in a nutshell, framing is about how presenting information in different ways can emphasise different aspects of a reality. And different frames can present the same information rather differently. Now, unfortunately, this is not something that the conservation movement has necessarily always done terribly well. So, lesson one, how you say something is as important as what you say. And so different frames emphasise different aspects of a reality, and all information exists within some kind of frame. So you cannot escape framing. And that means that you can either be aware and try to be strategic about how you frame your messages, or you can remain ignorant and blissfully haphazard in your framing. So which will you choose? Lesson two, emphasise the things that matter to your audience. And so that's not necessarily the things that matter to you. Now, issues can be framed to suit different agendas and audiences. So where possible, tailor your message to your target audience. And this includes thinking strategically about who the audience will be and who the best messenger might be for that audience. And you'll also want to think about who you want to reach and what you want them to do with the information that you're giving them. Lesson three, use social norms. So social norms are the informal rules of a social group. And there's lots of research that demonstrates that telling people how others like them behave can influence how they will subsequently behave. And generally, people will behave similarly to how they think others behave. And so, for example, people are more likely to litter in an environment that already has lots of litter, because this sends the message that littering is a normal behaviour in this space. And so there are a few hard and fast rules in framing, but in being mindful about social norms, you should emphasise the prevalence of desirable behaviours, as well as the social approval of those behaviours, and always avoid emphasising the prevalence of undesirable behaviour. So even if you think that you don't want to bother with strategic framing, then you still need to understand it, especially when it comes to norms, to make sure that you avoid evoking an unhelpful norm. Lesson four, reduce psychological distance. So psychological distance includes geographic, temporal and social distance, as well as the relative likelihood of the event occurring. And reducing psychological distance can make an issue more tangible and make people more likely to take action. And so for those who can see the slides, the campaign poster on the right seeks to reduce psychological distance by increasing the vividness, both with the visuals and with the language, by personifying the whale, and it also avoids mentioning that the hunt is occurring far away in Antarctica. And it also talks directly to the viewer. Lesson five, leverage useful biases. So there are many cognitive biases that influence how we think, often in predictable ways, and a message can be framed to take advantage of or to avoid certain biases. And so one example is the way that people often respond more strongly to negatively framed messages. And a good demonstration of this was made in a study by Patricia Winter in 2006, which I've illustrated on my slide here for those who can see. Otherwise, you can just imagine it. The negative instruction here of don't go off the path was more effective than the positive instruction of please stay on the path. And so there are many different biases where humans act irrationally but predictably. And even if you don't want to use these to your advantage, you should at least still be aware so as not to accidentally trigger a bias that works against you or your message. Now, also just a point, I'm not suggesting that here that negative framing is always better. This is actually something that's very dependent on context. So all of this is published in a recently-ish peer-reviewed paper, so you know it must be true. But if you're like me and you do not like reading papers very much, it's summarised nicely in a NESP fact sheet, which you can find online and probably at the ICON website as well. And if that's still too much for you, I can send you a printable desktop flyer. And I'm happy to circulate these for anybody who's interested. But please act fast because biodiversity will be around for a limited time only. Thank you. And I believe I'm handing over to the owner of this slide.
I quickly interrupt proceedings briefly because I forgot to do something that I'm feeling a little bit bad about, which is to acknowledge that we are on Wurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation and to pay our deepest respects to elders past and present. Thank you, Pia.
Thanks, Sarah. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this Comedy of Errors. I can't see what they can see, and that's a bit disconcerting, but I'll do my best to communicate whatever I'm trying to communicate at this stage. So here I'm here to talk to you today about something that is very near and dear to all of our hearts, which is, of course, thank you, which is, of course, coffee. So here in Melbourne, because we're a proud people, we like to think that we own coffee culture, and it all started here. But of course, it didn't start here. Coffee, well, Arabica coffee, of course, originally came from Ethiopia. And those of you who can see the slides can see a lovely monument in the middle of the town of Jimma, which is in Ethiopia, which is the birthplace of coffee. And it's commemorating their deep connection to this fantastic crop that we love so much. So in Ethiopia, where coffee originated, coffee is actually a shrub. It's a forest shrub, and it grows in the forest underneath a canopy of various trees, of species of lots of a very species-rich forest with various heterogeneous layers. It creates fantastic habitat for birds and monkeys and all kinds of things, and that's fantastic. You can see an Ethiopian coffee farmer here with his coffee crop. Now, when you grow coffee this way, the natural way, under the shade, it grows slowly, it grows deliciously, and it provides really important habitat for biodiversity. Now, coffee slowly spread from across Ethiopia to what's known as the coffee belt. So coffee is grown either side of the equator, sort of roughly from the Tropic of Cancer to the Tropic of Capricorn. And you can see here that it's a globally really important agro crop. So coffee's worth about $200 billion annually. It's grown across 10 million hectares of land, and it supports the livelihoods of 100 million farmers. So coffee is important, coffee is widespread, and those of you looking at that map who know something about biodiversity probably also realise those are some of the most biodiverse areas in the globe. So just to illustrate for those of you who can't see, we've got places like Brazil, Indonesia, Colombia, Vietnam, all of Central Africa. The most biodiverse and threatened ecosystems are the same places where we grow our coffee. So as I said, this map, some of you can see here, is a map of global threatened species richness. And I've just shown you some species there to illustrate the kinds of wildlife that are really dependent on these ecosystems. So we've got toucans, we've got tree kangaroos, we've got orangutan. All of these things are really dependent on the integrity of those ecosystems. So at the same time that we're growing coffee in these really biodiverse areas, we're facing challenges, because even though the price of coffee globally has been declining slowly, we've globally developed an insatiable hunger for it. So there's a huge demand for coffee. We reckon in the next 50 years, we're going to have to double or even triple the amount of coffee that we're able to grow in order to meet that demand. And that's a problem. It doesn't sound like a problem. It's like, yeah, coffee for all. But the problem is that we're also facing climate change impacts. So this map shows the areas in red that are going to slowly become less suitable for Arabica and Robusta, which are the two kinds of coffee that we like to drink. So we're going to lose about 60% of the land that's suitable for growing Arabica by 2050, and about 40% of the land that's suitable for growing Robusta. So we've got this huge demand. We've got climate change impacts. With the climate change, as well as the areas being climatically unsuitable, you also get disease impacts. And that's a problem, because farmers have to continue to support their families to sell coffee. So how do they do that? Well, as I alluded to, traditionally you grow coffee in these wonderful heterogeneous polyculture systems, like you can see here in a coffee forest, a rustic coffee forest. But if you want to grow more coffee faster, what you do is you intensify. And so you move from a polyculture to a monoculture. Perhaps you might have one or two shrubs growing over the top, tree species growing over the top of your coffee, all the way until you reach what is a complete coffee full sun monoculture. So this is a landscape in Brazil that was previously lowland forest, and it's now a monoculture. And that's a problem. So I didn't come here just to depress you. Obviously, I came to tell you how you can help. And there's lots of sustainability interventions happening all across the supply chain at the moment. So there's global initiatives from the producers to the farmers to the co-ops, all the way up to the retailers to try and address how we can make sure we continue to grow coffee in this lovely, sustainable, shade-grown way. But here today, I want to focus on the consumers. So that's you. You're the people at the supermarket, at the roasters, at your bougie cafes who are going to create a demand in order to for this shade-grown coffee. So one thing we often hear when we talk to consumers is that they're really overwhelmed by the options. They're like, I go to the supermarket, I look at what coffee's available. There's all these logos. I don't know what it means. I don't know if it's greenwashing. What do I do? What do I look for? And yes, a big question mark. What do I do? And so there's a few key things I want to tell you today about how you can minimise the biodiversity impacts of coffee. The first thing to realise is it's not just about certifications. It's not just about these giant international initiatives that are going out and supposedly certifying farms. There's a lot of really small coffee distributors and traders who are doing really good work on the ground, one-on-one with farmers. They're going out, they're seeing what's happening on the ground. They're offering farmers a fair price. So this is called relationship coffee or direct trade. There's individual communities who are taking on some of these impacts themselves and who are saying, how can we better support the community and the forest? And there's coffee tourism. So don't just feel like you're limited to looking for certifications. But if you're in the supermarket, the three things I want you to do are choose wisely, ask questions and create demand. So we've got partners at Smithsonian Bird Friendly Coffee at the moment who have more bird friendly coffee in their hands than they can sell. And so what we need is demand, because at the moment you can't buy that here in Australia because the sellers don't think it's there. So choose wisely. Firstly, look for words like direct trade, wildlife friendly, bird friendly, shade grown, habitat conservation. Something's better than nothing really in this space at the moment. Secondly, ask questions. So we're so used to these days, well, I am at least, going to the supermarket, or when you go and buy timber, you say, where did this timber come from? Was it sustainably harvested? Where did this fish come from? How is it farmed? How is it caught? What's in this soap? Is there palm oil? Was it responsibly sourced? We're used to asking these questions and we need to start asking them about coffee as well. And then finally, as I said, create demand. So go and talk to your local barista. You know, they like talking if you give them the opportunity, a lot of them. They like talking to people about coffee. They can be a bit insufferable, but you just got to push through the pain and ask them, where is this coffee from? How was it grown? Was the farmer paid a fair price? All of these things are obviously connected. If we pay farmers a fair price, they've got an incentive in order to protect the local forest. And with that, I'd like to say thanks, and I'll hand over to Casey, I believe.
This is where I stand.
Who knows?
Hello, everyone at home. Hello, everyone in the theater. I'm Casey, and I'm an architect. Probably from this drawing, you probably may have worked that out. This particular drawing we had put in a magazine. It was really just to illustrate some of the ideas about how you might support biodiversity in your choices around your home, how you design it, how you renovate it, how you maintain it. So I'm going to talk a bit about that today and taking some of the key principles from this diagram. Really, when we think about this, there's three main things we try and do. We try and provide resources, we try and minimize threats, and we try and improve connectivity. So a lot of the strategies that when we think about what we do in the residential area and the design area is sort of one of those three things, leading to one of those three things. So I'll sort of go through a few of those with you right now. One thing when we talk about creating provision, biodiversity enjoys structural diversity in the plant. So if we're talking about the critters and we're trying to bring more critters in an area, we want structural diversity. I mean, the golden rule, it seems, on this planet is diversity is always a good thing, at least in my opinion. So improving the diversity of the plants and the structural diversity, when I say structural diversity, I mean the heights and the canopy fullness and all the sort of things always helps. In built environments, we're kind of limited because in nature, we get that nice diversity in a lot of our landscapes. But when we come to hardscape buildings, we don't always get that. So one of the things we can do is provide green walls, green roofs. And when you do that, if you're going to provide a green roof or a green wall, keep diversity in the back of your mind. You don't want to just have a single plant species that you're growing up. Might look nice, but if you can get a mix of different species, and think about this strategically on the building's pathways to move species around, either from one part of the landscaping to the other, from the walls to the roof, and vice versa. So it becomes really important to think about green walls and green roofs. Some of these can be pretty intensive, some of these low intensity. It really depends. There's lots of information on it. I don't have time to go into all of it, but just think of it as diversity, green walls, green roofs, one way you can get more biodiversity around your house. The second is actually providing additional habitat, so habitat analogs for species, nesting places. There's lots of things out on the market. There's bee bricks, there's bird bricks that you just swap out different bricks in a wall. You can actually create facades that have cavities for different species. The thing to keep in mind when you are looking at some of these products is they're very specific. All species have different requirements, and so you want to make sure that you have consulted with ecologists and done some research on the species that you're trying to attract. But always a good idea to try and provide extra little places for critters to live in our buildings that we don't always do at the moment. These can be in the building structure, they can be separate to the building structure, but providing those extra cavities are great. As far as reducing threats, so there's two big ones. One is if we have lots of glass, which we love, we can see out and see nature, and that's important for us. If glass isn't done the right way, you can get bird strikes to the glass. So thinking about using, there's lots of products out there, bird-friendly glass, which actually has a pattern that the birds see that we don't. Other ways to mitigate that is to actually tilt your windows, design your windows, or provide shading fins or something that breaks up that surface. Really, it becomes either the bird's looking through it or they see a reflection, they're attacking. Those are the things that draw them to glass. The other thing that is usually problematic is lighting for wildlife. You can get wildlife-friendly lighting, and so we have a spectral range that we can see in our vision. Other species have different spectral range. So if you change those bulbs, we'll still be able to have usable light to see where we're going for safety, but it doesn't affect nocturnal critters as much. The other thing is to think about shielding. So we want the light to go exactly where we need it, nowhere else. A lot of times we just install a fixture and it just spills out everywhere. So shielding and thinking about the right spectrum of light are really important. And those are very easy modifications to the residents to let critters live around you. So this slide here shows a few things with the spectral lighting I was talking about. The other thing I want to talk about is pet containment. We heard a bit about that earlier. So cat runs are a good one to design into your structure. They're also really fun to build. There are kits out there for catios. I just learned this today. I think Holly knows this. There's people here who have cats. So building areas for your pets that are exclusive so they can't get out and get a hold of wildlife, but still allow the enjoyment for pets is another way to add on to your house and make your residents more biodiversity friendly. And finally, another one that I like to think about is to try and actually elevate above. So you can have a house that's a slab on grade, or you can have a house that's on stumps. And you can be strategic about raising some of the house and allowing some of the vegetation and stuff to cruise through into the house. Why is this important? Well, you get connectivity, not only on the site, but if you have some sort of overlaid plan and design across a neighborhood, you can get really good connectivity with critters through that. So thinking about raising up that plate, at least in part of the house, to allow some areas for connectivity and also areas for refuge for some of the ground dwelling critters. So these are just a few things. There's obviously lots more, and if anyone ever wants to have a chat about, I'd love to chat architecture and biodiversity. That's me. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks, Casey. So we were talking about inside. Now we're going to talk about, well, we weren't talking about inside. We were talking about the built form. Now we're going to talk about your gardens or your backyards. So why am I banging on about biodiverse backyards and balconies? As we've heard, the things are not great for nature in our cities. Cities are intensifying. They're expanding, they're fragmenting the precious remnant habitat that's left, and the little patches that are left often being built on. This is all bad news. And things look a bit like this sometimes, which I find very depressing and makes me sad. This is in Perth, so maybe it's better here. It's not. But the good news is that you can actually do something right on your doorstep for biodiversity. And one of the things we found recently is that actually we can do a lot with a very small amount of space. So I think we think a lot about nature needing these big old parks, but it doesn't. And as Casey's been talking about, there's stuff you can do actually on your buildings. But how do you biodiversify? I'm sorry, I just came up with this today and it's maybe not a good idea. How do you biodiversify your backyard or balcony? And I also am encouraging you today to become a nature noticer. So biodiversifying your backyard or balcony. I just did this recently. For those of you playing along at home, you can see some pictures of my very tiny courtyard. This, when we moved in, had nothing. There was nothing there at all, no green. In fact, there was fake green, anti-green, perhaps one might call it. But with a few little garden beds and some well-placed planters on our balconies, we've actually managed to introduce lots of stuff for nature. So what specifically, and I'm just going to flag that this is also work that we're doing with a colleague who couldn't be here today, Catherine Berthen. You can check her out on Twitter, CityCat75, and she is tweeting about specifically what our native pollinators in urban spaces need. And Katie's work has shown that diversity is really important. And planting things like daisies, eucalypts, flax lilies, and pigface, those are the #1 things around Melbourne for our native pollinators. When we're talking about native pollinators, we're talking about bees, beautiful blue-banded bees, cool little tiny black bees. We're talking about butterflies, flies, moths sometimes get forgotten. And let's not forget about the things that eat the pollinators as well. And you can't see this in the room, but there's a cute little jumping spider on this picture. So plants for native pollinators. When in doubt, plant natives if you can. But actually, there's lots of stuff out there that bugs and butterflies really like to eat that's not native. So even things like citrus trees can provide a really good resource, but try and choose natives and choose a variety. And an important thing here is providing something all year round that flowers. So try and think about putting something in that flowers during the winter. I think we think a lot of the time that in the winter all the bugs go away, but actually there's heaps of Australian native bugs and butterflies that are active all the way through the year. So look for some things that flower in winter as well as in spring and summer. What about our birds? So I'm biased, I'm a bird person, so thinking about birds is great. And there's 2 or 3 kind of rules here. A mixture of small and large flowers. We all love these beautiful, great big grevilleas. There's one on the slide here. They look stunning. They produce loads of nectar, but actually they're only really good for feeding big, noisy honey eaters and big, noisy parrots. And when we have big, noisy honey eaters, we lose lots of those beautiful, small little birds, like the tiny honey eaters, which are my personal favorite. So big flowers and little flowers. An example of some little flowers is there on the left of the slide, the orange ones. Those are aromophillas. They're a little bell shape, so you have to be a tiny bird to get the nectar out of those. Bonus points also by having flowering plants, things like banksias, wattles as well. You also get seeds, and there are heaps of seed-eating birds out there too. So thinking about a plant that provides both flowers and seeds. They also flower and lots of invertebrates like them as well. So that's really good. But what about our little insectivorous birds? So things like fairy wrens, my personal favorite. So fairy wrens, they also need some denser shrubs. So planting some things in your garden that have kind of close foliage or are down near to the ground so that tiny birds can hide is really important. Diversity is key here. So having different heights and structures is good for both birds and bugs. And again, thinking about things that flower all year round. Now the picture that you can see up there is Kings Park. So I'm cheating a little bit. Kings Park over in Perth is huge, but the point is you can take those elements and put them into your tiny garden. And there's some overlooked things here. We've talked about controlling your pets. It's no good building a biodiversity haven and then having your cat come and eat all of the birds and frogs. We don't want that. You don't want that. So control your pets, minimize pesticide use, rodenticide use as well. That's really important. There are some owl-friendly rodenticides out there now. They're quite hard to come by, but head to the BirdLife Australia webpage for a bit more information about which to use. Think a little bit about nest boxes and bee hotels. I'm going to put a note on bee hotels. Our native bees nest in loads of different things. Some of them love clay, some of them love to nest in straw, some of them want to bore into wood. So if you're going to put a bee hotel in, put in lots of different types of things for our different native bees. And don't forget about things like frogs and reptiles. So a pile of bricks is a really good place for a gecko to hide. And you can even put a tiny pool of water in, and you'd be surprised what can turn up. If you are going to put water in, don't forget to put in a few sticks and rocks so that if someone falls in, they can easily climb out. And I'm also going to encourage you to become a nature noticer. We are still learning a lot about the urban environment and the kinds of different ways that animals are interacting with it because it's a novel environment. So you can actually help us out by collecting data, become a citizen scientist. If you're sitting out in your beautiful biodiverse garden on your balcony, walking to work, maybe you've gone down to the park, see what nature you can notice on the way. You can even just put this into iNaturalist, which is a really great app. Not only can you learn stuff on the app, but it's also all the data is collated into the Atlas of Living Australia. And that's a really useful resource for Australian ecologists all over Australia, not just in urban areas, but in urban areas in particular. And there are also some local projects, and I'm just going to quickly plug the Superb City Wrens project, which is taking place here in Melbourne. It's a citizen science project, and we want you to go out and find our banded fairy wrens. They're all around Royal Park. So that's it. 2 ways to help. Biodiversify your backyard or balcony and become a nature noticer. And I think that's Thami now. Thanks, everybody.
Lucky last. All right. I'm not sure how many of you can see this, but there's a beautiful house here with really rich nature. And I wonder how many of you actually have the opportunity at the moment in your homes to have that rich nature experience. I certainly don't. I've got a small balcony. It sounds like Holly's done some good work with her little courtyard, but for most of us in our homes, nature's pretty difficult to experience still. Similarly, with our workplaces, not a lot of us have workplaces like this, which are lush experiences of nature at work are hard to get. So as an urban planner, that really makes me feel like the onus is on us in cities to make public space a place where we can experience nature in, at scale and have lots of nature experience. That's got me very interested in streets. I'm obsessed with streetscapes. It's kind of becoming a central bit of my doctorate. And if you look at a map anywhere in the world, go on Google Maps and you've got the big, thick yellow lines. Those are our arterial streets. Between them, you've got this network of white roads. That's our little local streets. And I was surprised to see a paper the other day found that that's public space, but it's a much bigger proportion of public space than you might expect. In fact, 90% of all the public space that we access in our lives is streets in most cities. So streets are a central area, a big place of our lives. And unless you're going to a park every day or really quite often, streets are the places, streets are the public spaces where you actually have an opportunity to experience nature at scale. Unfortunately, at the moment, a lot of our streets look like this. So for those of us here, it's a big grey road. And studies have shown that the way that we allocate space in our streets at the moment is hugely biased towards cars and parking cars, moving cars around. Often we just get a little strip of footpath that's actually so thin you can't even put a tree on it. And that means that we have a terrible poverty of nature in our streets. Our lived experience is actually really quite deprived of streets. But the flip side of that, the silver lining, is that because we've been so generous to cars historically, it's almost got to the point where we feel like streets are for cars. That's what they're about. But they're not. They're public spaces, they're flexible, and we can do what we want with them. We can reallocate space in our streets to different things. Now, because we're a mixed audience with different visibility, I'm not going to go through the details of quite how much space we've given to cars and streets, but bottom line, even in the best cities in the world, most of the street space in an average street in a place like Amsterdam is still for cars. You go to a place like Los Angeles and over 90% of street space is for cars. So there's a bit of fat that we can take there. We can take it back. So I'll skip ahead. So I don't know if you guys can see this pie chart, but the big idea, that blue area, that's roads and parking. Currently, average street somewhere in a city here in Australia, 2/3 of it is given to cars and parking. What I think we can do, and what I'm going to show you is possible, is that we can carve away a little strip of that and have a little wedge that is a space for nature, so that you and me, in our day-to-day experiences, when we're walking with our kids, when we're going to work, we can actually see nature at scale in urban places. So what does that look like practically? Here's a big example from Sheffield. I'm going to show you some big examples and then some smaller examples. This is a before, and sorry guys, you'd really have to lean in, but because there's a beautiful point of reference that I've boxed out, which will help you find where you are in the after. They took, I think, a 4 or 5 lane highway. They carved out most of the lanes. They put a busway on it and a cycleway and a walkway, and they've put a huge expanse of greenery with lovely understory and a lot of big healthy trees. That is how you do biodiversity in a city at scale. It's really quite spectacular and just so much of a richer place to be. But of course, you know, that's the big stuff. It's the expensive stuff. It's the politically difficult stuff. There's lots of simpler ways you can do it. And I think Casey's really nailed it on how to do things on your building. This is London, where you've got beautiful planters on structures. This is Copenhagen in Denmark, which has got lovely green facades all over the place. It was quite surprising to find it. But, you know, it doesn't have to just be on buildings. We can actually reallocate space in streets. Take a walk around Fitzroy right here in Melbourne, and you will see streets where they've carved out a section of the median. They've taken out a couple of parking spaces. You can still drive there, you can still park, but there are big healthy trees and there are lovely spots of understory that have been creatively carved out of streets. It's quite impressive, and it really means these streets are lovely places to be. Last little thing, you know, some streets, maybe it's not that easy to carve out the space, but just doing things under trees. In a lot of council areas, you can actually do that. You can put some plants in under a tree, or you can apply for a little community garden spot. And when you see those coming up at scale, like this example in Carlton North, you can actually get quite a nice amount of that vegetation that's so important for insects and birds in our cities. And lastly, to close, this is a little example of a pop-up that happened in Brunswick a few years back. And it really emphasizes we don't have to make these changes at scale immediately. We can try them, we can pop them up and experiment. So for those of you wondering what you can do for streets in your cities, just 4 points. Firstly, start seeing your street as a public space that we've chosen to give to cars at the moment, and we can do other stuff with. Talk to your neighbours about that, because if it's just you thinking about streets differently, you might not get the change. But once you've got a street where you've got a few people who really want change, that's when you can start seeing a street really become something else. Then ask for the change. Councillors at local governments are actually quite accessible people. Often they're elected from groups like us. I've got mates who became councillors. It was quite surprising. And then, you know, their staff probably have ambitious urban forest strategies and that they're still wondering how they're going to implement. So if you come along and you say, hey, I've got a street, we actually want to take some of our parking spaces away, make it a bit narrower, get some big trees in, fantastic news for them. So you can do that stuff. And lastly, remember to do it yourself on your own buildings. I think Casey's already covered that, but you've got loads of opportunities. Just put some flower pots up, put a little community garden in, whatever it is, but you can do these things. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I think we were meant to have another 15 minutes of question time, but hey, we can thank the concussion experts again for kicking us out of our actual legitimate space where we're meant to be having this presentation. Wonder if there's just like 1 or 2 burning questions before we wrap it up for the evening. If anyone's got a question, or anyone online. I can't.
I can read it.
Okay.
From Shivani, I'll just turn my mic. It was, oh, no, not doing that. It was after Piers' talk about the coffee, I think. So it was with labels such as sustainable and ethically made, sort of used recently, and yes, people being concerned about greenwashing. Is there anything being done about legislation or how, like, is there any, to make it difficult for people to kind of just use those terms?
The greenwash. Not in Australia, as far as I'm aware. There are policies. A policy almost went through in America, and there's one that's gone through in Europe that companies that are linked to deforestation due to coffee and cocoa farming can actually be prosecuted now, which is really good. So it'd be great if we had some legislation like that come through in Australia. But no, as far as I'm aware, and others in this audience might know better, I don't think there's anything similar in Australia to stop you from saying, I mean, you're limited in terms of what certifications, what logos you can put on your packet of coffee. So if you've got the actual legitimate fair trade logo, then you have to be fair trade. I'm sorry, I should be looking over here. But anyone can call themselves sustainable or green without those specific certifications. Yeah. But questions?
Just a question about how we're doing with nature strips. They seem purpose made for many things you're talking about, but we're still building developments around Melbourne with the classic grass nature strip, maybe with a tree in it these days. And people are out there, you know, mowing it with fossil fuel equipment on a regular basis, or not maintaining it at all. It's generally a bit of a biodiversity desert. How do we use that incredible, very, very visible, you know, resource that brings homeowners, renters together with their community, their council, to do better things?
It's a really great question. It's one that Casey and Sarah and I have been working on at the moment with one of our projects, all to do with biodiversity sensitive urban design. It's a tricky one. You're quite right. There is a huge resource out there to have some incredible nature that people can access every single day. And actually, Thami is touching on it too. It's knotty. There's the handing over of the nature strip to different people is kind of part of the issue. And when you're talking specifically about those greenfield developments where we're kind of losing the biodiversity on the edge, and then there's kind of nothing going back in. We are working with Lend-Lease right now to try and, I guess, build a different model for how to do that from the beginning. So getting them to think about the nature strip as a bit more of a extension to a park, perhaps, especially because we're putting in parks at the same time. And we're hoping that that kind of idea might then translate into how the council then views the nature strip, as it's not something to be mown. It needs a slightly different management technique. And then there's also the kind of ownership that can take place by the people who actually live right by the nature strip. And there's some really great work happening in this space with the Heart Gardening Project, you might be aware of in Melbourne, being run by an incredible grassroots organiser, Emma Cutting. And she's been really pushing lately to change some of the legislation around and the guidance that councils provide around nature strips to allow people to actually do a bit more on their the nature strip that's outside their house. But it's difficult because it's something that kind of first in a green space, it sort of starts with the developer putting things in, and then ownership gets handed over to the council, and then the council has to decide whether that's something that they want the residents to take on. And if the resident doesn't want to take on, then the council still needs to manage it. So that's why you kind of see this sort of like, well, we'll just put some lawn there and hope for the best, because yeah, it's hard, I guess, is the answer. And but we're trying.
Great question. I think we're going to wrap it up for the evening because it's 6 o'clock and we probably all have dinner to get to, or I think in our case, we might go and have a hard-earned something or other at some place nearby. I just want to really thank my exceptional colleagues for kind of rising to the occasion, to be honest. I think you're a top bunch, fun to work with, and I love the fact that we can pull together a presentation like this that really highlights some of our excellent work, but is so practical and, you know, something we can think about in our everyday lives. So thank you, guys.